Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today on HR infrastructure audit and how to find gaps and fix your gaps in your HR. Today, we have Kim Matus and David Norton guiding us through today's session. And with that, I will hand it over to them.
Thank you, Anna. I'm David Norton. I'm one of the senior HR consultants here at HR Service, and Kim Matus, who's our vice president of HR, is joining me for this presentation. Our newly minted VP of Human Resources. You
Yeah.
just got the promotion. Yesterday was your first day in the role.
Yeah, pretty new.
Yeah, but you've been with the company 8 years, 9 years now.
Yes, I've been a colleague of David's for several years doing, yeah, as an HR senior VP, so similar line of work. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Okay. So you know what the topic is. We're talking about the audits, the infrastructure, compliance gaps. Before we get into the meat and potatoes, of course, the legal people always like us to give the disclaimer here that this is educational, informational. This is not legal advice. So with that technicality out of the way, what we're going to be looking at is understanding the purpose and need for auditing your human resource processes, identifying the HR structure, infrastructure, I should say, recognizing where you have some gaps and mainly what to do about that, how you're going to prioritize your risks, and building an action plan. So, why does this even matter? What's the big deal about having an HR audit? Um, Essentially, we're wanting to reduce the legal exposure here because if something happens, whether you get an external auditor coming in or you get a litigation coming in, you want to make sure you have your documentation and your paperwork all in good shape. You want to be consistent in how you're applying things so that you don't end up opening yourself up to allegations of favoritism or unfair. It helps to increase the efficiency if you have good systems in place. You're not scrambling every time something comes up. It supports the growth of the organization and preparing for investigations if things do go sideways and you find yourself dealing with a legal situation. First, let's talk about HR departments in general. And Kim, you can chime in on this a bit as well,
Hmm.
certainly. This is not David's monologue. Um, but typically, we've seen that initially very small businesses or new businesses tend to have a rather reactive HR function. Other than doing the hiring, they only do something when it's needed. So it's very reactive. There's no planning. As time goes by, it becomes more administrative in nature. And then we're focusing on compliance. As businesses get bigger, they fall to having more legal requirements which need to be fulfilled, things which have to be met, reports which have to be done. So it's still very much of a paper pushing thing, but there's more of it to deal with. And then the top of the pyramid is where you get into more of a strategic function where HR is truly a partner with the executive team, is seen as a member of the executive team. Kim, what's been your experience with seeing
Yeah.
things like this?
Yeah, and I think the important thing to kind of look at with the HR audit component too, as David was talking about, a lot of times when you hear the word audit, it sounds like this formal process, it's pass or fail. But with the role that David and I do, we see so many different organizations. It's such a variety of structure that really what it is it's a good tool to just create a gauge, kind of a gauge of where you're at, and then create some consistency and some continuity. Like, oh, okay, great. Just need to expand this a little bit. Oh, we didn't touch on this. We need to develop that or work through that a little bit. And then we kind of partner and build what those plans look like. So the audits are actually a great opportunity to kind of, look at it from that angle because nothing's perfect. I rarely see, there's always some opportunity for some improvement. And then sometimes, you have organizations where it's finance department that does the payroll that also gets to do HR, and so maybe it's not their area of expertise. So I just kind of, highlight what that looks like. But the reactive part too is so common because businesses, I mean, it just it pivots from day to day. And so you can't always come up with what's going to happen. It's just a part of where we're at. But the goal is, to David's point, as you build through that, you hopefully get that structure and then you reach and you meet whatever your goals and objectives are in the HR functions, you align those with the business strategies, and then you get to kind of streamline some of those strategic components too. So there's a variety of different buckets, and we'll get into those too. But yeah, that's kind of the experience that we've had here too.
Fair enough. Thank you, Kim.
Mhm.
So within the infrastructure, and this is not in sequential order by any means, but the key elements would be having a handbook that is somewhat optional, but it's good to standardize things. And handbooks can be as basic or as complex as you may want or you may need. The employee handbook for a 10-person operation and a 1,000-person operation are going to be radically different for all the obvious reasons. Job descriptions. This is something that we see lacking a lot of the time, and job descriptions are really important, particularly once you get above 15 employees, because then you fall into the American with Disability Act provisions where you need to be able to talk about the physical requirements of each job function. Hiring obviously is a big thing in your hiring processes. I promise we will not spend much time talking about AI and hiring, but that's part of our lives nowadays. Personnel files, human resource files, whether you're keeping hard copies or electronic, how you're doing that. Performance management tools and techniques. By the way, I'm just going to interject that HR Service offers an online performance management tool, and we have an HR audit assessment, which is available online as well. I have to throw a little commercial in for the business while we're talking, right? Other infrastructure things. What sort of benefits are you offering? And what's your training program? And the training you'd want to be considering beyond the obvious things of how to physically do the job, how to, correspond where files are kept. But there are safety training requirements. There's sometimes some legal compliance training which is necessary,
Mhm.
evacuation training, emergency response training, things like that, which are not part of doing the job but should be covered, need to be covered as well. So, what are the types of audits? A compliance audit is where you're checking, are we in line with are all of our I-9s done correctly? Are our tax forms done correctly? Do we have the personnel jackets segregated properly with the information about the employee as an employee in one place? Things like their application, their job history, their wage history. That's all the things that them as an employee versus those things about them as a person, which is their benefit signups, their tax elections, their direct deposit, anything which relates to the person as a person and not necessarily as an employee. You have operational audits, making sure that the HR function is operating smoothly and the right people are doing it and there's a good flow to it. And the higher level is the strategic audits where you're saying, all right, this is where we are today. Where do we want to be in January of 27, July of 27, and so on. So
Mhm.
these are things. Kim, anything you want to add on that?
Just to reemphasize, again, a good vehicle to organize kind of what your path is, what your goals of, the organization from an HR standpoint are, and kind of highlighting the areas to focus on. I mean, hats off to HR professionals because that first bullet point in compliance, we know that can go so deep into so many different areas of the business. And what David just talked about on the slide prior, I mean, those are just the handful of the buckets and the areas, but there's a lot going on from a compliance standpoint. So it's always good to have that second opinion to just kind of make sure that's in order too. But there's different components and then aligning business needs with the strategy. That's kind of where you engage with your executive team and things of that nature. So a really helpful exercise to keep some of those pieces productive and in line with what's going on in the business.
Fair enough. Thanks. Okay. Dig a little bit deeper into some of these things. Hiring. You want to make sure that your applications are in compliance. I know a lot of companies have tended to just Google a generic application and download it and slap their logo onto it. And that can work, but you got to make really sure, particularly in California, New York, Illinois, there are certain things which can and cannot be asked. Colorado, other states that have things, and you want to make sure that your application is compliant. Make sure your application has something on there which talks about that the candidate authorizes you to conduct background checks, reference checks, things like that. The interview process. This could be a 16-hour class all by itself on how to do interviews in a compliant manner. The best practice we've seen is that you have a basic list of 5, 7 questions that you ask every single candidate. And that way you're showing the consistency in case you got challenged on a discrimination, unfair hiring practices, something like that. You can show this is what we use. Now, obviously, every conversation is going to go a little bit differently after you say, hello, my name is. That just is the nature of a human interaction. But by having some sort of a basic script, as I said, a half dozen, 8 I think is really the most number of questions, because again, in the conversation, other questions and back and forth is going to hopefully naturally ensue from it. And of course, if it doesn't and the interview is over really quickly, well, that's kind of an answer in and of itself. Background checks. You need to be aware of the Fair Credit Reporting Act and what the requirements are, and that people need to authorize having the background check done. There's a number of online services that are available where you sign up for it, and you basically plug in the candidate's name, email, and phone number, and hit send, and then the company, the background checking company, contacts the person, and then they are, by virtue of the fact they're putting in their own birth date, their social security, they are authorizing the check to be done at that point. Offer letters are again something you want to review. Make sure you've got some consistency in how it's being said. Offer letters, there's lots and lots of different options available. Google it. AI at ChatGPT can generate some really good offer letters because it's a generic thing. You'd want to customize it a bit for your business, but if you got nothing, the AI tools can be very good. Now, note I'm saying can. My experience has been that from working with a particular, in my case, GPT platform, it kind of learns just from the various questions I give to it, my style, and I think that's true for anyone who's using AI. But it's a working with sort of situation, and there's a better understanding of how things need to be done. Or again, you can just Google something, but check that there's nothing in the offer letter which is going to get you in trouble. And again, the EEO compliance. This is for employers of 50 or more who have federal contracts, or 100 or more employees in general. You have to do the EEO record keeping, and that's where you need to make sure you have the gender and the nationality so you can report that back on the EEO1. Kim, did I miss anything there?
No, I mean, I think a lot of clients now are using resumes for, they're kind of going away with the application days and they use resumes. And I think you see a lot of activity in that whole interview process and who's interfacing with the candidate and making sure the training's been done and things of that nature. And to David's point, there's a consistency in what that process looks like. And then background checks, I mean, as he's mentioned, there's the federal level, which is pretty consistent, but then the states are getting there's a lot of activity in different states lately with background check laws and things of that nature. So more and more employers are going remote. They're talking to candidates in different states. So that adds a little bit of complexity to what some of these buckets look like. So this is another area to really deep dive in. And it's not only about being compliant, but it's, finding and getting the right candidates and getting a good practice that works well for the organization. So there's a lot of, to David's point, there's a lot of areas that you could do a webinar alone in this structure, but this is an important bucket because this can be, some good time to train.
Right, very much so. Okay, looking at personnel records, I touched on this a little bit. You need to keep the things organized, separated. The I-9 should be kept separate from the personnel files, and the the personnel files. Again, you've got the stuff about the employee as in the person as an employee, and as I said, that's their application, their resume, their offer letter, their onboarding paperwork, any raises which may have come up, any disciplinary records. Let's be honest, that does happen. Things that relate to the person as an employee. And then you've got the personal stuff which should be kept segregated, and that's their tax filings, any medical insurance enrollments, if they have a medical situation where they have been off or a medical excuse, something like that. They have a work comp injury. That all needs to be kept separate from. And you want to make sure that you have the documentation standards. What I mean by that is you want to have a standardized practice so that if this HR admin person leaves and is replaced a month later with this HR admin person, you have an internal practice which can be followed. It wasn't just a by gosh and by golly and who's warming the chair this week and that's how we're going to do it. That never works out. Wage and hour is a big one potentially. Classification, is someone exempt or non-exempt / hourly? That is super critical. Are they an employee or are they an independent contractor? I know that early in my career, I was classified at a company in Southern California as being an independent contractor, even though I was 100% under their control. Excuse me. I was also in college and didn't know diddly squat. And then in retrospect, once I got into the HR field, I'm going, wow, they really weren't doing that right, were they? It made sense from a business standpoint. It just didn't happen to line up with the Fair Labor Standards Act. Timekeeping practices is really important. If you have a manual timekeeping system or if you have an electronic system, overtime, again, the overtime ties in with the exempt versus non-exempt. What are your overall payroll practices? You want to be checking that. Most companies are in good shape with this because the electronic payroll systems that are in use or the external providers keep everything in line. But if you have a really small company, just a couple, 3 people, and you're handwriting checks out of a checkbook every couple of weeks, that's where you got to be more careful about that.
Yeah.
And final pay. Final pay is something that gets tripped up constantly because each state seems to have its own rules as far as you have to pay them within 24 hours, or you have to pay them by the end of the week, or you have to pay them on the next pay period, and it just gets very complex and confusing. And if you fire someone, they have to be paid right away. If they quit, they can be paid the next check, except in this case where they have to be paid within 24 hours, except it can be really complex. So make sure you're super aware of that. Kim, were you going to jump in on something there?
Yeah, I think the other component we see a lot of is off the clock work. Especially with your non-exempt employees with, cell phones and texting being so prevalent. There's a lot of communication and just work texts and responding to emails off the clock. The onus is on the employer to make sure that they're aware of that and that time is being tracked accordingly with employees. And then as mentioned, the classifications. So exempt status is a big one. Sometimes we see a lot of classifying employees as salaried, exempt because they're salaried, or maybe they're the manager of this department. But yet, when you dig into, they got to meet the job duties test and the salary basis test, as we're aware. So, there's just tweaking some of those components and really looking at those areas with a fine tooth comb. But I think those can oftentimes be a big piece with wage and hour.
Fair enough. Okay. Hey, before we move on, I meant to mention a couple of things at the very beginning and forgot. The webinar is being recorded. You will be receiving a copy of the slide deck tomorrow. And if you have any questions, there's a Q&A box here in the Zoom feature that you can click and put any questions. We will cover those at the very end. Benefits and notices. Boy, this is another big one. And when you have companies that are larger in the, what do I mean, 30 to 70 plus or minus, you're not big enough to really need someone watching this all the time, but you're big enough that you have to be in compliance. So COBRA records, if that's for 20 employees or more, and then there's state mini COBRA things. HIPAA, if you're dealing with any sort of protected medical information, personal information, health information. The SPD, the summary plan description, wraps, your brokers can help you with that. Insurance marketplace, the ACA marketplace, Obamacare marketplace, anything that might be happening there. If you have anyone who is taking insurance from there, because that can run you afoul of the ACA, Affordable Care Act requirements. And then annually there's the Medicare Part D notices, which have to go out to all your employees, particularly those who are Medicare age and older. So this is an ongoing thing. Next, we're going to get into the fun part of leave, and I'm going to turn this one over to Kim to play with this one.
Oh, yeah. This is another area where, depending on the size of an organization, but a lot of us are familiar with FMLA, where that kind of cuts off at the threshold of 50 employees. And there's several organizations that maybe don't hit that mark, or what's becoming common is you don't have them within the 75-mile radius. So it kind of, the next piece to look at is that next law of ADA. And as you can see, 15 employees is the cutoff there. So that's a broad group. And what we see a lot with ADA is missed opportunities for employers to go in and really go through that interactive process. First and foremost, employees usually don't come in and say, I need a reasonable accommodation. They're not going to use that language. They're going to say something like, my back, it's hurting and it's affecting, what my schedule looks like, or maybe it's some anxiety that's causing some concentration issues. There's a whole slew of different components that employees will talk about, where that's where it kind of looks at the employer to kind of be aware and go through that process. And really what the interactive process is just an individual assessment, not just a yes, no. You kind of want to go through the steps to see what are the medical limitations, what does that look like? So we see a lot of areas for improvement in what can be that ADA process, or some mistakes that employers can make, and for good reason. It can be, there's a lot of variety that comes in from employees when they're different situations. You got mental health and physical health and things of that nature. So the PWFA, Pregnancy Workers Fairness Act, 15 employees. We're looking at currently with the Trump administration, there are some preliminary pieces that are being looked at. So this continues to evolve, but a lot of protections with your pregnant workers or anybody going through that type of situation, not just your paid policies or your company policies, but what states are you in? If you've got short-term disability, there's a lot of different leave laws that can intersect when it comes into play with that. And then USERA, of course, is with one employee. And then state leave programs, as I mentioned. This is a big piece that's continuing to gain traction. Lots of different states are, adding in, whether it's their paid sick leave, but then also their paid leave programs. So the complexity alone can be a lot to handle. And then just the variety that you get from employees from time to time can all, cause for different, just a little bit of pause to kind of make sure that the processes are in place and the forms and all the different components. So you're making sure that you're being compliant and also creating that fair space for employees where it comes up.
Okay, thanks, Kim. I just want to clarify a little bit the FMLA, ADA, Pregnant Worker Fairness. We all understand those. USERA is for those who are called for military service. It stands for Uniformed Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act. Quite a mouthful, but anyone who is called in for military training or military service, they have certain rights and reinstatement protocols which need to be followed. And those can be particularly challenging because if anything goes sideways on that and they file a complaint, you've got the U.S. military asking you questions, and from personal experience, those guys do not have a sense of humor. Okay, performance management. We're talking about things here of setting goals, annual, quarterly, whatever works out. Coaching, realize that there's a big difference between managing and coaching. Again, that could be a webinar all in and of itself. Consistency. Here's where, again, you want to be sure that your supervisors are being consistent, particularly if you have a situation where you have a department with multiple shifts and you got one manager over it and you have two very different personalities running each shift, and make sure that there's consistency in how that's being done. Documentation, I would say that absolutely in the HR world, document, then document that again. It can be a real pain and a real headache. I understand it. I have had those headaches many times. But the bigger headache is needing the documentation 6 weeks or 6 months later and not having it. Had a situation up just yesterday with one of my other clients an employee who worked from 2010 to 2015 needed some records from that. Well, that's been 11 years and more. We just don't have that. But this is potentially becoming a headache because he needs something to show certain records and certifications took place during his time with that employer. And then lastly, corrective actions, disciplinary actions. Nothing anyone ever likes to do. But they are part of the world of managing and supervising, and knowing you should always have your HR people involved in it, but you want to make sure the HR people are cognizant of what the right level of corrective action is, and the timeliness of it is important also. You don't want to be writing someone up today for something that happened back in April. The currency and the what's the word I'm looking for? Keeping it in the same timeliness. Still
Yeah.
not the right word, but you get the sense.
hmm
Talked on this briefly earlier. Safety and training. So there's OSHA training is required. Fire extinguisher training, evacuation training, emergency response training. If you have a larger company, you're going to have first aid responders on site, general safety practices, lifting practices. Are you in a situation where certain safety, personal protective equipment is required? So those are all critical things. They're not part of doing the job per se, but doing the job safely is absolutely important. Harassment prevention training, abusive conduct prevention training. A lot of states require this on an annualized basis. Again, throwing in the commercial for HR service, we provide that. We have some videos of these things which would be available in English and in Spanish. So these are things which are really necessary, and realizing there's a big difference between a hostile work environment in the legal definition and a really unpleasant work environment. They're not the
hmm
same things. Abusive conduct is one thing. Rudeness and poor social skills is a different one. Then you've got supervisory training, making sure your supervisors understand what can be done, because we've all seen the situation where the person who gets promoted to the supervisory role is simply the person who's been there the longest, or is the best liked, or knows how to make the most parts per hour. but they're not given any real training in how to lead, how to manage, how to coach people, how to do performance reviews, how to handle disciplinary things if they pop up. Uh, Even things as simple as the mechanics of processing payroll at the end of each pay period, and how they have to check and audit the timesheets to make sure that everything's right. I've had situations where people were put into the supervisory role weeks and months before and never were officially told. They just kept asking Joe to help them out. Well, Joe retired last week, so who do I ask now? And then lastly, cybersecurity. I hate to mention it, but boy, this has just gotten a bigger problem. And there's not one of us on this call that hasn't dealt with spam and junk mail this morning. I absolutely guarantee it. And some are more annoying and riskier than others. There's fraud. There's credit card fraud. We have a whole module on how to deal with phishing, PH phishing, and scams and such. So these are important training things to have. So we're going to hit here the top 10 compliance gaps that we have seen. I'll do the top first 5, and Kim, you can do the second 5. Outdated employee handbooks. Again, handbooks are not legally required, but if you do have one, make sure it's current. You should be checking it once a year, once every other year maybe, but beyond that, you really have to go through and make sure that things are current. Missing or incomplete I-9s, and in the current administration practices, as we have seen regarding immigration and all of that, we're hearing more and more that there are audits being done by the government of I-9s, and if it's missing, that's a problem. If it's incomplete, and incomplete can be something as simple as the employee didn't put their telephone number in section 1. Oh, that's incomplete. That's a penalty. And again, with any outside auditor, it's going to depend on their attitude and generally how overall you have been cooperating with them. Again, we have a whole module that we've done on I-9 handouts and compliance. Misclassification of employees, touched on that earlier with exempt versus non-exempt versus independent versus employee. That's something that we see regularly. And I've had particularly smaller business owners say, I want to make all my people independent contractors so they can go get health insurance on the marketplace and I don't have to pay health insurance for them. Well, okay, but that's not really how it works. I can see all the advantages from the business owner's standpoint of doing it that way. It just kind of doesn't follow federal labor standard guidelines. And then missing notifications. These are the notices we talked about, the SPD and the what were some of the other the Medicare Part D, the notices that have to go out to employees. Okay, Kim, I'll have you take page 2 here.
Perfect. Yeah. With leave authorization errors, we touched on this before, but the depth and the different variety of different leaves, and just making sure staying on top of the different paperwork requirements, especially if that's FMLA. With ADA, a lot of times leave is an accommodation that you're looking at. So, and with that, it touches into how are you handling benefits and what that looks like. So a lot of different parts moving with the authorization in leave management. Overtime and wage and hour errors. We see these a lot from the state, where a file's been claimed and employers have to go back and look at their records and polling what this looks like. But a lot of the areas, that we're looking at are bonuses for non-exempt employees that are not paid accurately or not processed through payroll. And you think a lot of payroll systems are good and sophisticated in a lot of ways, but if you don't manually stay on top of those pieces, those can create quick errors that can add up or be costly. So a big piece with the wage and hour and with FLSA and lots of different buckets to look at. Weak supervisor training. This is more to what David was talking about. This is a lot of pieces where managers come in, and having that fundamental program where you're providing a consistent training program. We don't see that articulated and mapped out a lot with employers because, quite frankly, there's a lot of different moving parts. They don't have the personnel, they don't have the bandwidth to do that. But this is where you can create some of those errors. So making sure that there's a platform or training program for the leaders so that they're on the same page and you create some of that consistency. It adds to the culture and certainly can help with some of those compliance pieces that we talk about. And then incomplete files, making sure, how do you store them electronically? That's usually not the case where you have them in the old paper file. Just a lot of pieces with keeping those in order. And then you've got personnel records, different laws with employees, and those change by state and what they can request. And then your whole with performance management, inconsistent discipline. So it's common where you may have one leader that handles a situation or a practice and maybe doesn't go through the formal process. And you have another leader that stays on top of those pieces. Not only within teams, but within companies, you can have some misalignment with your discipline practices and how you document that. You want to show not only just for the culture of the employees so they know what to expect and they can create or they can expect consistency, but just from that compliance piece, if you're ever challenged, those records add up and the documentation adds up and that consistency is in place.
Fair enough. And again, I went through a situation some years ago where there was a problem with the disciplinary practices. That shift one, the supervisor was kind of a martinet and very, very particular and very, very particular and watch the clock. And the second shift in the same department was way more hang loose and kind of didn't care, and he didn't last a huge amount of time. But it ended up with being a problem with in the same department. The practices weren't the same, and if someone was on the first shift and was 2 minutes late, they got written up, and someone on the second shift was 20 minutes late, they probably wouldn't even get a talking to. And the documentation wasn't kept well, so it ended up one of the first shift people got fired, got an attorney, was able to successfully show that a half dozen people on second shift had nothing, so the termination got reversed. Back pay reinstatement, 8 months back pay. Real expensive lesson for that employer. Okay, so off of the horror stories, and here's an example of how to plan these things out. You've given us a lot of information, David and Kim. What do we do with it? And what we do with it basically is set up a calendar. This is based on a calendar year, if you want to do it on a fiscal year or whatever makes sense. But just as a starting point, there's 35 of us on this call here, so there's 35 different ways of doing it, if not 70 different ways of doing it. But your first quarter, you want to be making sure your labor posters are up to date, checking the break rooms, check where you have your labor law posters. Can't tell you the number of places that I've gone into, one of the first things we look at is the labor law posters, and it says copyright 2018 or copyright 2011 or something. It's like, no, you really got to get these updated. Not every year necessarily. Ideally, yes, but every couple years, certainly. And then ACA, the Affordable Care Act reporting, that's due by March 31st of each year. Then you can calendar to do your second quarter. You're going to audit your files. You're going to go through your folders, make sure that everything is separated the way it's supposed to be. Third quarter, you're usually starting to prep for the budgets at this point for the next calendar year. You want to do the wage review, make sure that things are right and make sense. Again, some years ago, dealt with a company that had a problem because they had a lot of people doing more or less the same work, but the wages were off by literally pennies. So the same person could be doing the job for $22, $22.05, $22.10, $22.15, and so on. And that caused a problem. And the issue tended to be that, well, this guy has been late a few times, so I docked him 5 cents an hour to send a message. Or this person is always, goes above and beyond, so I gave him a whole whopping 10 cents more as a thank you. It ended up the Department of Labor kind of didn't like that. So you want to make sure that you've got some consistency, particularly where you've got a group of people doing the same thing. And this is a case where 50, 75, a buck an hour, that's a lot easier to explain than a nickel an hour differential. And then you want to go through at the end of the year, check your handbook for consistency, see if there's any trainings. We all know that typically, except in the insurance industry, typically the last quarter of the year and that's a good time to get your mandatory regulatory training things knocked out for the year. Kim, why don't you take this one?
The checklist. Yeah, so a lot of different areas to cover. Checklists are always a good way to organize it, but policies, we think of our handbook. A lot of times those get dusty, but really they come in handy. Going through and just scrutinizing what those policies look like over time. We see extensive COVID policies and handbooks, which that was 7 years ago, 6 years ago, that was relevant. But just updating policies and keeping those consistent so that you can accurately apply them. And then your records, from your personnel records, documents that you're training or keeping in place. You want to just make sure that there's a consistent practice there. Training, how are you documenting what that looks like if it needs to be documented? In some cases, like states with sexual harassment training, there are some requirements. So it does relate to what your practices are and how you're keeping records or keeping track of that. Benefits are, in the world of HR, there's a lot going on in the world of benefits that, in fact, get kind of overlooked. Like, when SPDs get sent out to a new hire versus when a change is made, and how are those employee notices being tracked, and are they being sent out? So different pieces with benefits that can easily get overlooked, and that's a sweet spot for HR Service Inc. because it's a whole umbrella that we have historically helped with, from either on the broker side or obviously on the client side as well. And then with the leave, just making sure, depending on what your size is, what states you operate in, what that looks like. So breaking down what will be required in notifying employees and all those pieces, and how you're keeping records too. Payroll is a whole separate component. But record retention for payroll records and with wage and hour. And then, of course, if there's safety, like I mentioned, some safety training, and with OSHA requiring and keeping meeting notes and things of that nature. So a lot of different pieces to keep track of. And it's just a good practice. And with tools like the audits, it kind of helps to identify what's the best areas to focus on, and then just kind of move from there and kind of keep that evolved and keep that compliant.
Fair enough. Here again is a sample 90-day action plan, and there's no requirement for this. It simply is a suggestion on how to handle these things. But you're going to spend your first month figuring out your needs. What's important? What are the priorities? Red, your yellow caution items, and what are you good on with a green light? Second month, making the corrections. And then the third month, monitoring. How well did it work? Are the changes? Do we need to rinse and repeat and go over it and see what's necessary? So this is just a way of approaching cleaning things up of those areas which are necessary. So the main takeaways from today's presentation: make sure you have a solid infrastructure in place. Audit your processes and your programs on an annual, or at the most a biannual basis. Fix your high risk issues first. So your trainings are a big thing in the current administrative climate. Anything that could be a safety compliance is a big thing to keep in mind. Make sure your supervisors are trained, and they're trained consistently, particularly if you're dealing with shift work, and that the people who are working the afternoon or the night shift, or same thing, the day shift people. And then document. With that, we're at the Q&A portion. And Kim, are there any questions that popped in that you know of?
Yeah, we had a good question with I-9s. So the question is
Okay.
that they've heard conflicting information about storing I-9 forms. One was that they needed to be kept separate from the rest of the employee's personnel file, one folder per employee or separate drawer. The other is that all I-9 forms can be kept together, all employees together in one file, same drawer. What is the proper way to keep these files compliant?
Well, actually, both of those approaches are compliant. Uh, One is it's a lot more work than is necessary. My own experience is I've seen uh, people typically keep the I-9s in three ring binders, alphabetical by last name, and that works just fine. And I've gone through audits, and it's accepted doing that way. Going to individual I-9s in individual folders, yeah, that works too, as long as the I-9 is not kept in the personnel jacket with the rest of the employee's information. It's kept discreet and separated. Either one works, but the three ring binder is just fine if you want to go above and beyond and have each I-9 in its own dedicated folder, in its own dedicated drawer. Really nothing wrong with that. It just seems an extra bit of work depending on how big you are. Any others?
That was it. And I'll just add on that too. Federal regulations don't necessarily specify expressly that you have to keep it separate. But to David's point, a good practice is you don't want it in the personnel file because in the event of an audit, you don't want to hand over additional information. And so just, getting to that I-9 is can take time. So it's always a good practice to keep it separate for that reason. Then it's less work to do in the end. So most times it's one drawer if you're using a paper copy. And then of course there's the electronic and there is regulations on you can't just store it and just call it a day. You have to make sure that you meet the requirements for electronic record keeping as well. But yeah, that was it for, oh wait, how long do you keep the termed employee I-9s? Was
Terminated
the
employee I-9s are there. There's two ways of looking at it. Either uh, um,
3 years after
1 year past yeah, 3 years past the
date of hire,
date
right?
of
Yeah, date of
hire,
hire.
or two
Yeah.
years past the date of termination, if that's the longer period. So if you have someone who's worked there for a few years, you keep it for 2 years past their date of termination. If they haven't
Or
worked there
one
for a
year.
while,
Yeah. You're right. One
then
year after
for yeah,
termination
you keep
end.
it
Yeah.
for 1 year. Yeah, yeah,
So 3 years, date of hire, 1 year after termination, depending on
right.
the later of. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, later.
Um, they want to know more about the audit services. Was the other
Let's
one.
pop into that. We got some more I-9s. Let's do the
Yep.
I-9s
We have
first, and
more
we'll circle around
slides,
to audit
so we can get
services.
into that. Yeah.
So we can't just keep the I-9s in our iSolved HR system. Yeah, that would be fine if you've got an electronic system, as long as they're easily retrievable. That's fine, because when iSolved or any other payroll company got their system set up, I'm sure they had that reviewed by their own legal people
Yes.
and whoever to make sure it was in compliance. So
I
that's
like this.
perfectly fine.
Yeah, I like this question because that's a good clarifier. Like ADP or some of these big platforms, they're compliant from from what we see. So they track who's been in there. You can't just go in and change something if, the HR generalist has a folder electronically in there on their computer. That doesn't necessarily meet the requirements. But if you're using a software or a payroll system, just double check that's compliant. But that's a really good practice that a lot of employers are doing nowadays electronically through their system. And then the last one, let's see,
Okay.
do they need to be kept separate from the current employee I-9?
No, you can keep them all together. That's fine.
Yeah.
You just want to, if it's easier for you to separate them out for whatever reason, I've just seen them kept together, and then every 6 months or so, someone prints off a list of the terminations and goes through the binder and shreds the or hits delete if it's an electronic file for the people who have hit their expiration date. Okay, more about our audit services. Well, that's a good segue into all the services that HR Service provides. We have first our top program is the HR package for the fractional HR support, where Kim, myself, one of our several colleagues, we're your remote HR team. We handle all the aspects of HR as much or as little as you would like. For X amount of hours per month, you work that out with sales. I'm not in sales. I'm not going to try and talk about the pricing because there's lots of variables and geography and blah, blah, blah. And that can be for 2 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours, 10 hours, 20 hours, 30 hours a month, whatever is appropriate. We have the HRE Solutions program, which has online training modules, online compliance assessments. It has an online handbook generator, all these things that you can do. It's a self-service portal. You sign up for the service. It's fairly inexpensive. It generates all these things. And then there's the projects, which is gets into the questions posed of, we can create bespoke handbooks for you. We can do compensation audits. The compliance audit, we can either do it online, or if you're here in the Salt Lake area, we can come on site to do it. Well, for that matter, we can do it remotely too. It just tends to be a little more expensive. I did a compliance audit 4 years ago in Colorado. Spent 3 days over there. We can help with recruiting, with training, any other HR task. If you're interested in learning more about the audit process, the next slide is going to have the contact information. You can reach out to our sales team, and they will tell you more about what's involved, find out what you're looking for, and get you set up. But yes, absolutely, we can do this. Then we have ERISA eSolutions, which provides the SPD wrap, the summary of material modifications when there's plan changes. I'm not going to read the whole slide to you, but essentially we cover everything here, and we do the 5500 and the ACA reporting for you. We're rapidly heading up to the top of the hour here. So if you have any other questions, you can contact HR Service. Here's our phone number. There's the email, solutions@hrserviceinc.com. HR Service, singular, not services. Can't tell you how many people get trapped up with that. So HR Service Inc. And there's our website. So thank you all for being here today. We appreciate it. We're going to go ahead and close out the presentation at this point. And Anna, was there anything you wanted to add at the end here?
Nope, just thank you guys so much for a really valuable session. Just a friendly reminder that you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to today's recording, so you can just revisit whenever you want to dig back into it. But thank you again, everyone, for joining, and we hope to see you at the next webinar.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.